Hello, everybody. We live in the age of the super rich. It's not really news, it's dominating our media. Everybody watches The White Lotus and Succession, supposed to be tragic comedies about the billionaire age. Of course, it's the age of Musk and Trump, not really so much political as economic. The battle of the billionaires, and it extends to the battles between Soros and Bezos, another couple of billionaires or billionaire clans. It's extended even to billionaire weddings. We're sometimes reminded that these people are mortal. There's a piece in the media today about a billionaire friend of the Prince of Wales who died after swallowing a bee, which reminds us that these billionaires are indeed mortal. So how to describe our age? It's brilliantly described by our guest today, an old friend of the show, Evan Osnos. The haves and have-yots, dispatches on the ultra-rich. And Evan Osnos doesn't need much of an introduction. He's joining us from his home city, at least, of Washington, D.C. Evan, is this the best way to describe our age, the haves and have-yots? Did you come up with that term? It's a brilliant term. I know it's associated with a piece that you wrote for The New Yorker a few years ago, I think from 2022.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think I don't get credit for the coinage originally. It's been rattling around a bit over the years. It felt to me, though, that we hadn't seen it on the cover of a book. And I decided that as I was poking around on this topic, there were some of the obvious ways one could describe a book of this kind. You could say it's about the 0.01%, or you could have another more conventional description. But I thought that capturing it this way might convey what is, frankly, my particular preoccupation, which is the interior life, the anxieties, the motives, the drivers that go on, particularly at that seam between the haves and the have-yots. There's something there that seems to ripple through our lives all the time.
It's a little disappointing in a way. I mean, it was Fitzgerald, of course, who famously said that the rich are different from you and me. And I always assumed, or hoped at least, that they didn't have interior lives, that these billionaires, whether it's a Zuckerberg or a Larry Ellison, apparently, who is now even richer than Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, that these were slightly mindless people sitting on their yachts. But are you suggesting that the super rich have inner lives, Evan?
Well, I think that they have, in their way. There is a human smallness about some of the decisions that then end up reverberating on this vast scale. And frankly, it's that combination of people being motivated by quite specific idiosyncrasies, but then ultimately having this impact on all of us that I found to be the interesting fact. I'll give you just one example. You take Mark Zuckerberg, who I write about in the book, and his fixation, his fascination with the Roman Emperor Augustus is more than a casual fact for all of us. I mean, he learned Latin when he was a teenager. He went on at some length with me about his fascination with Augustus. In fact, when he was on his honeymoon in Rome, he and his wife came back with so many photos of the two of them with statues of Augustus that she began to joke that the three of them had been on the honeymoon. And, I think, and even if you're not a classicist, knowing that this man models his thinking about history with a call it a recurring interest in the trade-offs required for impact makes you want to know a little more about what's going on in his mind.
I've always been intrigued by Zuckerberg's change of hairstyle. Do you think when he goes to the hairdresser now in San Francisco, he asks the person to make him look like Augustus?
Well, for a while, he has had different phases of Augustus. There was the Caesar effect early, and now he's entered this new, more unbound era, both in follicular terms and I think in other ways. And that we're kind of living in that, Andrew, now is the unbound billionaire period. Um,
But in all, I mean, it's hard to be serious about these people. I mean, I always thought of Zuckerberg. I mean, he's obviously a smart young fellow. He's not so young anymore, although he has a youthful head of hair. I mean, isn't he ultimately still just the son of a New Jersey dentist who got rich quick?
it's an essential insight, actually. You're right that in a way, the defining fact of his life is that he hit it big when he was still a teenager, then dropped out of college, as we all know. And then, as a result of that, was able to sculpt an entire universe around his own values and preferences. I mean, to the point that I think this detail gets lost, but is worth keeping in mind. The reason why Facebook is blue is because he's red green colorblind. And so that means that he quite literally created a world that suits his perception and avoids his blind spots. And I think you could then take that idea and it extends beyond matters of design. And so we are living in this world in which a few people's perceptions and blind spots ends up having an impact on a lot of people.
And I wonder, again, it's hard to resist bringing Freud in here. He may be colorblind, but the fact that the Facebook color is blue reveals his preoccupation, consciously or otherwise, with yachts, because yachts have a bluishness about them, don't they?
Well, in fact, just last year, he got into the yacht world. In fact, he bought a super yacht, or to use a technical term, a giga yacht, which he was able to get, according to the trade press, at the bargain basement price of 300 or so million, precisely because it had been commissioned by a Russian businessman who proved unable to take possession because of the indignities of European law and sanctions. And so there's actually been a few people in Silicon Valley who have recently, as the yacht industry puts it, stepped up to the plate by getting in on some of these boats that were orphaned by the war in Ukraine.
I mean, the original yacht man is Larry Ellison. And he always seems particularly absurd with his dyed hair. There was a photo of him with Trump and the OpenAI guy. I've forgotten his name now. What's his name?
Altman.
Sam Altman. I don't know how I forget it. And Ellison looked particularly absurd. I mean, I don't know how much you write about Ellison in the book, but why does he dye his hair? Do these people think they're immortal?
Well, I think that the question of mortality is actually central to the matter. I've come to see that, and we've all heard about the various ways that some of the billionaires are trying to extend their lives, either organically by injecting themselves with various things, or perhaps by uploading themselves ultimately to
and Thiel is
format.
a very good example of this, who's a
Exactly.
pioneer at both of living forever and of developing technology to allow others to do it too.
And I think that becomes more than just an idiosyncrasy when it begins to inform how they imagine themselves in history. I mean, this is where there is this concept, this self-definition that another CEO in Silicon Valley who's quite unhappy with this kind of thinking, he put it to me. He said, this idea that we are giants who move the needle of history is in his mind. He said, it's the thing I hate most about living here. And I think there is a strange.
Who is that? I mean, they would do it anonymously.
No, he said it on the record.
Who was it?
Max Levchin, one of the founders of PayPal.
Yeah, one of the PayPal, one of the original PayPal.
Yeah, and kind of interestingly, is it a bit of a different? He's not in the same place politically as Thiel and so on. And I think there is a way in which that ecosystem in which you're constantly surrounded by others who define themselves as being the makers of history. We are the ones who do things. I mean, remember the great motto that was on the cover of the Whole Earth catalog. Remember the kind of proto Silicon Valley document. Really interesting chapter in that history. But the motto of the Whole Earth Catalog is "We are as gods, and we might as well get good at it." And I think there's a way in which that's become operationalized now, to the point of, I mean, to say the quiet part out loud here, to the point of almost kind of cartoonish grandiosity in many cases.
Yeah, and the Whole Earth Catalog, of course, was put out by Stuart Brand, who's now in the business of re-engineering species. In historical terms, I mean, I want to get to the book itself, but in historical terms, I know you compare this generation of have-yachts with a late 19th century, early 20th century have-yachter, Andrew Carnegie. I'm not sure if he ever had a yacht, but Carnegie now, of course, is remembered as someone who gave back, who donated to libraries, whose philanthropic model offered something for have-yachters. I mean, there is Gates who gives back. Is there such a vivid contrast now, Evan, between the Carnegies of the past and our current billionaire class?
Well, that's what interested me, was to try to understand where this current cohort falls on this oscillating spectrum of billionaire behavior, because we've had all kinds. And there were moments in the 19th century, for instance, in sort of the what you might call the pre-Carnegie moment, when you had somebody like Jay Gould, who was, as Mark Twain put it, I'm going to massacre the quote, but he said it was he said Americans have always loved money, but Jay Gould, who was the richest man on Wall Street, taught them to kneel down and worship money. And then you had Carnegie and Rockefeller, who, for reasons that were a combination of their own biography and religiosity, had some sense that they could not shuffle off this mortal coil without giving something back. And so you had Carnegie built libraries, Rockefeller, of course, started the University of Chicago, gave a lot of money away. And then you have the Buffetts and the Gates generation. And they, you'll recall, set up the Giving Pledge, which encouraged some of their peers to give away the lion's share of their fortune. But then you get to now, Andrew, and that's where I think it gets kind of interesting and puzzling, why it is that Jeff Bezos, for instance, says that he thinks that his most important contribution ultimately is more about space travel than it could be about philanthropy. Or, take Musk, who describes his greatest gift to humankind as being the CEO of Tesla. And I think there is a puzzle here about why philanthropy has been less of a project for the current crowd than it was even as recently as 10 or 15 years ago.
Don't they, though, in a sense? I'm no great fan, as probably none of our audience are, of billionaires, but doesn't Bezos or Musk actually have a point? I mean, even Gates is controversial now. We've got an upcoming show about his $200 billion donation to Africa and the impact, quite negative in some ways, or certainly controversial, it's having on Kenya. Don't they have a point that if Bezos, or certainly if Musk is to pioneer the electric vehicle, that is going to have a much bigger impact than anything that Bill Gates can donate to Africa?
I think that it doesn't need to be a binary choice. It doesn't, in some ways, need to be an either or. I think these ideas move like a culture or a fashion. And right now, the fashion, as articulated perhaps most forcefully by Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist, is, as he said in his techno-optimist manifesto, that philanthropy is just an inefficient way to try to improve humankind. Now, look, I think that there are reasons for philanthropy beyond just the most specific calculation of impact. Take, for example, the moral message that it conveys to society, which is to say that the idea of obligation, the idea of power being also a form of responsibility, is something that is expressed either in explicit or implicit ways every time we open our social media and see what Jeff Bezos is doing that day. And if we see that what he's doing that day is out on his yacht with his fiancee, surrounding themselves with celebrities. Okay, society takes a message from that. But there's another way to conduct yourself. And look, I am alert very much to the performative qualities of these characters, in the sense that Warren Buffett knows that when he presents himself as just living in the same house he's always lived in Omaha, that's a certain kind of, there's a value in that. But it is also more than just a skin deep idea. And I think part of my purpose in writing this book was to just define and declare that we are living in a season of flamboyant oligarchy. That's what this is. There used to be, Andrew, an
Yeah, so it's the
expression.
age of White Lotus and Succession. I mean, the fiction
Exactly.
is
Yeah.
real.
And what's amazing about it is there used to be an expression in the private wealth management world that the whale that never surfaces doesn't get harpooned. But today it seems that the whales are rather competing for attention on the surface of the water, and I thought it was important to take stock of it.
Yeah, and they not only are competing for attention, they're actually investing in the attention economy, like Musk, who put $40 billion, mostly of other people's money, into X. You mentioned Mark Andreessen. I wonder whether Andreessen and Bezos are kind of bookends of our new age. I mean, Bezos seems particularly pleased with himself. He has a new wife, a new lifestyle. He doesn't seem to be particularly bothered with anything. I remember once bumping into him in a bathroom in Los Angeles, and he's a very amusing and amused guy, and he seems to be continuing that. But Andreessen and Musk, speaking of your term skin deep, they seem very easy to offend. They don't seem to be very happy yachters. I'm not sure if you spent much time with Andreessen or Musk. But again, coming back to this idea of the very rich being different from you and I, are they in their own way just as easy to offend, just as thin-skinned as everybody else in our social media age?
It's actually a very important observation. I think that their level of aggrievement turns out to be an important ingredient in now. For the
Which is
following,
totally absurd, right? That anyone could actually offend a Mark Andreessen or an Elon Musk.
well, I think, as Andreessen himself has put it on a podcast, I think he said there used to be a time in this country when if you built a great fortune, if you were an entrepreneurial success, that people would admire you. You'd give some money back and everybody would be very happy. I'm paraphrasing here, of course. But I think, and he says, but now they just get angry at you no matter what you do. And I think that what happened over the last 10 years was a shock to many of these guys. They are guys, meaning that they sort of imagined, because of the early years of Silicon Valley's embrace in Washington, in which they were treated as modern day Edisons and Ben Franklins, and then all of a sudden they're being investigated by the Federal Trade Commission. There's questions about breaking up monopolies, and they began to feel as if they had lost the culture. And what's interesting to me is some of them saw this coming. I remember talking to another billionaire who said, there will come a point when artificial intelligence begins to put a lot of people out of work, and there will likely be a big backlash against us. I think it just happened faster, frankly, than they expected, and their response has not been to say, well, okay, let's figure out how to get ourselves back into the cultural position we were in before. They've gone a slightly different direction and kind of tacked far outside of the conventional political conversation and said, well, fine, if politics doesn't want us, then we're going to do what we need to take control of politics.
Yeah, or just buy bunkers in New Zealand. There used to be a term, you don't hear it as much anymore, Evan, in Silicon Valley, where I live, which is fuck you money. That you have enough, that doesn't matter what anyone says. But even that now seems archaic, as you say. I mean, Andreessen gets offended. It's easy to offend him. He deletes his friends on social media. He blocks people, which is really just astonishing in its own way.
I remember when he started blocking journalists, and I was one of them. I don't think particularly
Oh, that's quite an achievement. What
for
did you do
personal
to
reasons.
be blocked by
I
Andreessen?
I suppose I committed journalism, but I think that part of what that gets to is actually a meaningful dynamic, which is that at a certain point, I think that the ordinary rituals and instruments of supervision, of oversight, of give and take, of cut and thrust, of what it actually means to be a powerful person in this country and to find yourself subject to some considerable attention became uncomfortable. That it was, they just sort of said, I don't really want to deal with this. I remember when I first started writing about this phenomenon of billionaires preparing for the end of the world, and I went to New Zealand and talked to people there who were building refuges and so on. That part of what began to take shape in my mind was this idea of a form of vertigo, that they become so exposed, so stratospheric, that it begins to feel quite frightening, and they have to be conscious, and maybe sometimes overly conscious, not only the risk of a public backlash, but also the possibility that a leader might say, I can't afford to have this billionaire wandering around causing me trouble. I'm gonna try to get rid of his power. And so when when we saw that scene on the inauguration stage, Andrew, which in so many ways was like,
Well, the billionaires lined up in homage to Trump.
exactly. I mean, that was the tableau of the early 21st century, the complete and total fusion of politics and plutocracy in the United States. And I think that we're going to be looking back at that moment and trying to decode the motives. And it wasn't entirely because everybody on that stage agreed with him. I think a lot of them did, certainly Musk and Zuckerberg and some others. But there was also a pretty hefty dose of fear at work there, that they had realized that having helped and enabled this authoritarian leader back into office, that they might find themselves on the wrong end of the stick.
Yeah, no, from that photo, of course, incorporated the CEOs of Google and Apple, Tim Cook in particular, who it's hard to understand why they're fearful. You wrote an interesting piece recently, late last month, in the New Yorker on Trump's politics of plunder. I don't want to turn this, and I'm sure you're bored of talking about Donald Trump, into another conversation about Trump, but is he fundamentally different? I mean, he claims to be a billionaire. Maybe now that he's stealing everybody's money with his crypto stuff, he is a billionaire. Is he fundamentally different, Evan, from everybody else, from Zuckerberg, from Larry Ellison, from Soros and Bezos and Musk? Or is there something about Trump that makes him somehow stand out, or perhaps makes him significantly post-billionaire in his own weird, surreal way?
Well, there is an interesting doctrine, a kind of scholarly literature on almost exactly what Trump is, that I found very illuminating. There's a scholar named Jeffrey Winters who's been studying oligarchy for decades, and he has this way of explaining the different systems. And Trump is what's known in the literature as a sultanistic oligarch, meaning that he is one among them, but he has been, in a sense, by mutual consent, has been elevated to rule. And that's because they've decided that ultimately he's pretty good for business. He's congenial to their interests. And so he is by no means somebody who stands in opposition. If anything, we know, because he has staffed his administration with 12 billionaires. We've never seen anything like that in this country. And he has said quite openly over the years, particularly in 2016 and 17, he said, I want to surround myself with rich people. I like those people that have succeeded, as he puts it. And I think that what we all know is that Trump, of course, has lived his life in this tension with the notion of the actual elite, the people who he considers to be the gatekeepers, who kept him out of Manhattan or kept him out of the country club in Palm Beach. And so he found his own ways in. He kind of got into
The poor
Manhattan.
boy from Queens who made good.
Exactly. And I think he found that there is a group of people who would defer to him and prop him up, and ultimately, in the case of Musk, do everything they could to get him elected. And that group does not evaluate him on the basis of his vulgarity or his kind of deficiencies of culture, the things that used to get in his way when he tried to get into the right clubs here and there. Instead, they're just saying this guy, in the end, and I've heard this over and over again from billionaires, frankly, who say, I don't like him personally, I don't like his character, but I think he's going to be good for what I care about. And that is the story.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know John Roush, of course, from Brookings. We did a show with him earlier this week, and he likes the idea of Trump as a patrimonial leader. It's borrowed from Max Weber and a couple of scholars who've just written a book about it. So I guess it's a billionaire kind of patrimonialism. It's new and old at the same time. Tell me a little bit more about the book, Evan, because you didn't sit at your desk in DC and write this. You actually went out. There are dispatches on the ultra rich. So you had the misfortune of being forced to sit on yachts in Monaco or Monte Carlo or in Palm Beach. What was it like? Did you have to hold your nose, or did you actually have fun?
Well, the truth is that I am not somebody who actually knew much about this world at the beginning, but frankly, I kind of approached it the way that I've done the same thing over and over again. I'm a foreign correspondent. That's just who I am. I can't really do much else. And I try to do that here in Washington too, in the sense of try to kind of approach this subculture and figure out what does the vocabulary mean? Why do people get respect and disrespect? Who is at the top of the heap and who's at the bottom? And what do they valorize?
So you're more of an anthropologist than a foreign correspondent, or an anthropologist of wealth?
I suppose so, an untrained, untutored one, but there I am. And, I found it to be a kind of reporting that felt to me as if it was political reporting all the time, even when it was in ludicrously comfortable places. I mean, I have to say it was the editor of the New Yorker who asked me to go out and poke around on this topic.
David Remnick, right?
David Remnick, and he said, maybe
was it a punishment or was it a reward for something? Were you being a good or a bad boy at the New York?
I suppose you'll have to ask him. I think it was presented as a reward. Look, I think there is a reason why I found myself interested not only in these yachts, these machines, which are, after all, the most expensive machines, the most expensive objects that human beings have ever figured out how to own. I mean, that's not an abstract point, Andrew. I mean, the most valuable work of art, the Leonardo Salvator Mundi, which sold for the high 400 millions, is now, not incidentally, believed to be hanging on a super yacht, which belongs to Mohammed bin Sultan of Saudi Arabia. So it felt to me as if this was a machine that could give form in steel and suede to this era that, whether we like it or not, is dominated by the power of giant fortune. And in the same way that I have always been fascinated by the Gilded Age, even when I was living in China, frankly, is when I first started reading Twain's description of the American 19th century. I think coming here and seeing from Washington the way in which money was not just reverberating and ultimately adjudicating the result in politics, but also shaping things as private and intimate as my child's emotional experience or my own attention economy. That felt to me like about as urgent an issue as I could think of.
You mentioned Mark Twain. We've already talked about Fitzgerald, of course, who was a keen observer of wealth. Wrote a wonderful series of books and short stories, The Rich Boy, Gatsby, of course. In your New Yorker piece, you write about Thorsten Veblen, the sociologist of wealth and writer on conspicuous consumption. Are there sociologists or anthropologists today, Evan, who get it? Or is the work of a Veblen or a Weber or even a Marx, is it still the best way of making sense of the super wealthy of our own age, the billionaire class who own these yachts, the most valuable things, as you say, we've ever produced?
It's a great question. I mean, the canon remains Weber, Veblen, and it's amazing how true some of their observations are. And it's not incidental to me that Gatsby turns 100 this year.
Yeah, and
Fitzgerald
we've done a number of
was
shows
right.
on him too. Of course, who
Right.
wasn't one of the super wealthy.
And it was, there's a great intrigue around the question of what he said and what he meant when it came to the rich are different than you and me. And Hemingway, though I've always been a fan, I think did him no favors in his interpretation of that moment. But to your question of a moment ago, there is in fact a cohort right now of really important scholars who are working on this topic. The first person I would mention is named Brooke Harrington, who's a sociologist at Dartmouth who is interested enough in the nature of big money and offshore finance that she went and got trained and certified as a offshore private wealth manager to then be able to tell this story from the inside. And I've learned a lot, not only from her writing, but also from a few what I might call the apostates. There's a brilliant tax expert named Bob Lord who spent years essentially structuring people's taxes to avoid having to pay or being able to make as much of an inheritance as possible. And he eventually decided, I'm not doing something good here. And he's sort of taken his skills and turned it in a very different direction and is now illuminating the nature of the American tax structure with extraordinary clarity, and he does it on behalf of a group called the Patriotic Millionaires. But I think,
And we've had him, but we had somebody else from that group on the show. So I have to get
yeah,
that sociologist. It's interesting in the Publishers Weekly review, and they loved the book, but I think they got it wrong. They said that you follow the 1%. It's not the 1%. I mean, Occupy created this illusion, I think, of the 1%. What are we talking about? How do we quantify the wealthy, Evan? Are they the 0.1%, the 0.1%?
in fact, if you really drill down on it, what you find is that we should be paying most attention to the 0.00001%, which is
Mm.
19 people today. And the reason why that matters is those 19 people in the United States, at least, they control about 1.8% of the nation's wealth. And the reason why that's meaningful is that if present trends continue, if we take the last 40 years and transpose them on the next 40 years without making any big changes to our tax and wage system, that group will control 18% of the national wealth. That's not an extravagant abstraction. That is just simply the arithmetic momentum.
So what we're talking about is 19 people, in theory, at least speculatively, controlling 18% of the wealth of the United States.
That's what happens if you follow this out. And I think it's interesting to me, if you're somebody who pays a lot of attention to Warren Buffett, for instance, and how he talks about money. For years, he has said that it's, in his mind, illogical and indefensible that he pays a lower effective tax rate than his secretary. And that has gone kind of heard but unheeded in Washington. There's really been no effort to reflect it. But he is also somebody who says that the simple power of compounding, the way that money creates money, that these things just grow, these fortunes can grow at an extraordinary rate, is perhaps the most important unannounced fact of our time. That once a centibillionaire, to use a term that never existed until recently, once a centibillionaire gets into that realm, it's very hard to lose it. I mean, we talked a bit about the fact that, I mean, take the fact that there was nobody in the world 10 years ago who had $100 billion. Today there are 15 people, and if the current trends continue, in about 10 or 15 years, we'll be talking about trillionaires.
Yeah, we will. I mean, you said this hasn't been reported. I mean, Piketty wrote a very influential book about it, so it is reported. I mean, economists understand
That's
it.
certainly true.
And Piketty warned about it. One of the books that you've had great success with is Wildland, The Making of America's Fury. So you're all too familiar with the anger now in America. Do you connect this anger, America's fury, this what Nietzsche, of course, famously called ressentiment, with the have-yots? I mean, your book is serious in some ways and less serious in others, but there is a deeply serious message here about the growing anger in America. It's not just the anger of Mark Andreessen, it's the anger of people who are struggling to put food on the table, the anger of people who are struggling to find places to live in, who now are living in their cars, the anger of an increasingly impoverished portion of this country.
You're absolutely right. I am motivated, as some writers are, by essentially one story that I keep finding new expressions for over the decades. And when I was writing Wildland, it was my attempt to try to understand the sources of America's distress and resentment. And I was writing mostly from the perspective of the middle and the bottom in places like West Virginia, which I've spent a fair amount of time in. My first job out of college was at a little newspaper there, and I've kind of gone back over the years. What I concluded ultimately was the reason for a book of this kind was that Americans are fascinated and in some way repulsed by this giant wealth. That combination exists in completely equal measures. And I'm not making a generalization. There was a poll just last year, and you see it repeated in many different surveys, where 59% of Americans say billionaires are making the country less fair. And 59% say, or in that case, 60% say they also want to become a billionaire themselves. And it's that duality, that very American combination, that I think drives this, one of the drivers of this moment, because Americans in the end, and I've looked at reams of data on this, they don't ultimately get very unhappy about the creation of giant fortunes. That in and of itself doesn't bother them. What bothers them to the point of ignition is unfairness. If the feeling is that it's an unfair route, or that somebody is using their power to then crowd out my ability to have my voice heard or to have my chance at the brass ring, that trips a wire in the American mind. And we find ourselves really right now, I think, in the teeth of that. That's the topic I'm capturing in this book.
As a foreign correspondent, you've also written about China. Your book, Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth and Faith in the New China, was another big hit. Is China any different? I mean, China now, I think, is minting, if that's the right word, more billionaires than anyone else. Is what's happening in China when it comes to the haves and the have-yots any different to what's happening in America?
It's a fascinating counterpoint in some ways. I mean, I watched in my years in Beijing, I lived there for 8 years and saw this advent of this new Gilded Age. In fact, that's what drew me to reading about the literature of conspicuous consumption, about the effects of some of these kinds of brazen moments of wealth. But the difference, of course, is that they have a political system in which you can't, in a socialist communist country, really have all that much of a casual relationship to oligarchy. And in fact, Xi Jinping, and I know this from having reported on him in some detail, he took a look at the post-Soviet example. He saw what happened in Russia, and he said to himself, I am never going to be Boris Yeltsin, in which I am hectored and surrounded and constrained by oligarchs. And in a way, I think one of the things that draws him to Vladimir Putin is that Putin, of course, came in after Yeltsin, and he thought Yeltsin had humiliated Russia, that instead, Putin was going to certainly not get rid of oligarchy. He was just going to make sure that the right oligarchs were in power. And Xi Jinping has made a couple of very demonstrative examples of people like Jack Ma, who was, after all, the richest man in China, found himself giving a speech in which he criticized government regulators, got off stage and was hustled off and was really disappeared for a few months, and now has returned to the stage in a much more docile form in which he claps along with President Xi at every opportunity. And the message to the rest of the Chinese plutocrats was quite clear. You don't mess with Xi Jinping. And in this case, in our country, the relationship between the oligarchs and the sultanistic oligarch is at this point much more companionable. But I think we saw in the breakdown of the Musk-Trump relationship that when you have this size of ego and fortune and competition, that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and we're all kind of scurrying around beneath them.
Finally, China, they don't want to be Boris Yeltsin. In America, of course, nobody wants to be Joe Biden. You're the biographer of Biden. You wrote a book, The Life, the Run, and What Matters Now. Biden has perhaps aged literally and metaphorically more dramatically than anyone else, even more than Boris Yeltsin. I can't resist asking you, Evan, for a quick response on the Tapper book and the debate now about Biden, but more broadly, the debate within the Democratic Party about our supposed age of abundance that Ezra Klein has triggered. So firstly, a quick remark on Biden. I mean, he's a friend of yours, and I'm sure you're very saddened by what's happened. But secondly, a broader conversation about what this book, The Haves and Have-Nots, tells the Democrats about the debate and the potential of abundance.
I think that the Biden story, let's be frank, ends in a tragedy, and there's no other way to tell it. I think I was always drawn to the fact, as one of his advisors once said, that you ask me who the luckiest person I know is, and it's Joe Biden. And you ask me who the unluckiest person I know is, and it's Joe Biden. His life had been this radical oscillation between success and failure. And I don't think it's a reach at all to say that, as the title of the book put it, it was an original sin to run for office again. I think that was a mistake that will unfortunately attach to Biden. And I came out of my last interview with him in January of 24, and at the time I wrote in the New Yorker that I sensed that he was gambling with his legacy, and that if he was wrong, that he couldn't persuade the country that he was up for the next term, that he would be judged harshly by history. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think that when it comes to where the party is going, I think that this question about an abundance politics or something further to the left, I went to a couple of these events in the last few months, including a Bernie Sanders rally, to try to gauge what the mood is. And I was struck by the number of people there who are not diehard Sanders fans, but found themselves at a Sanders rally precisely because they said, I'm afraid, and I want somebody who is speaking out and speaking up. There is a war within the there's a war within the Democratic Party right now about what the character of the party will be when it comes to money. And I've come to the view that I think that their strategic solution will probably end up not being trying to persuade Americans to give up on this dream of being rich, but rather giving Americans the information and the tools to understand why they're not. That is an answer that is not as clean and clarified as what Bernie Sanders is offering, but I think it is probably closer to the natural home of American ideas about money.
Well, there you have it. The Haves and Have-Nots, according to the publisher. It was supposed to be published this fall, but the They moved it up to June 3rd. Did they give you a yacht, Evan, in exchange for this new book?
I'll check the mailbox, but it hasn't arrived.
Well, next time you get one, I'll come on board and do some observation. I will watch you as you've watched The Super Rich. Fascinating new book. As always, a real honor and pleasure to have you on the show. We have to have you back. You've got so much more to report on in the contemporary, bizarre nature of contemporary America. Thanks, Evan. Congratulations on the new book. And we'll talk again in the